Scrap decks are another archetype that tend to ebb and flow on the border of competitiveness against the meta. I have stated before that scrap decks should get more good monsters of support to ensure their competitiveness, but at this point in time, that reality seems rather unlikely, so how can scraps try to be competitive in the modern meta with some level of consistency? Normally for archetype-based builds, I would go over the direct support in significant detail. However, due to a seemingly illogical and rather unexplainable strike from a specificity standpoint, my videos are limited to 15 minutes for the time being, so time's a wasting. Abridged version of scrap analysis, go! Scrap Breaker, Shark, and Kong are all cards that are rather bad when Factory is not on the field and are slightly positive with it on the field. The problem is that scrap decks built around the idea of always having Factory on the field typically struggle in the modern environment due to inconsistency. Breaker is also further hurt by being a level 6, which limits its effectiveness as a tuner material. Both Shark and Kong have the same problem in that without Factory, you're basically giving up a card in the hand, the Kong or the Shark, and your normal summon to get a card from the graveyard to your hand or add a scrap monster to the graveyard from the deck. When you can tie this into the special summoning effect of Factory, it's very effective. When you can't, you almost kind of just wasted the turn. It's not a good trade-off in most of the situations, especially for a deck like Scraps that have almost no cards that have any innate special summoning, and all those special summonings they do have really have these conditions tied to them that aren't easily achieved in most situations. Scrap Golem is a very nice card for this deck and deserves a spot. Golem instantly removes the pressure on the field to activate Dragon or Twins effect, as well as increases Synchro summoning probability. However, as a tribute monster in a deck with the 1-for-1 destruction concept, it does have some meaningful inefficiency in the hand, so it can be a bad draw. Thus, I only like to run one copy because graveyard recovering is not a big deal in a scrap deck, so unless you've unfortunately banished, you can get it back into your hand if you need it in your hand. Scrap Soldier is basically a high maintenance version of Scrap Goblin, and the extra maintenance certainly does not improve the card. If you want a monster to act as a wall, simply play Goblin. Soldier's additional attack is rather irrelevant. Orthros is another card like both Shark and Kong in that without Factory, the card is rather bad. With Factory, the card is good. However, unlike Shark and Kong, running one is advisable due to its usefulness as a special summoning tuner, but more than one typically reduces victory probability due to inconsistency and hand clogging. The thing that saves Orthros, in my opinion, apart from Kong or Shark, is actually the fact that it can be special summoned and it's a tuner. Not much needs to be said about Chimera other than it's a staple at 3 in any scrap deck. Normal summon Chimera, special summon a tuner from the graveyard. A vast majority of time it's going to be Beast, Sync into a Scrap Dragon, and proceed to make your play. Chimera will also be the scrap you grab from the graveyard a vast majority of the time with one of your other scrap monster effects. One of the goals of a scrap deck is to create a Chimera Synchro loop where you're Synchro summoning once per turn every turn, based on the normal summoning of Chimera. Chimera can also produce a rather effective defensive kind of stally strategy by tying its summoning into Goblin, where you continue to bring out Goblin. Chimera gets run over for some life point damage, but your opponents then can't run over Goblin. Goblin blows itself up. You get Chimera back. The Chimera that you just got sent to the graveyard comes back to your hand, you normal summon it again, so you can produce some form of stall there, innate stalling, if your deck's not getting the draws you need. Similar to Chimera, not much needs to be said about Beast either, other than it's the main tuner of the deck. It has a nice graveyard scoop effect, common among most scrap monsters. However, because Beast can be recycled by other scrap effects and will commonly be special summoned from the graveyard via Chimera's effect, running 2 is all that I feel is necessary, as having Beast in hand is not always a good thing due to the lack of innate special summoning capacity that scrap decks have, and 3 can produce periods of wasted draws. Hunter is just an inferior version of Shark, so there's no real reason to run it. If Run wants to run a card of similar nature, just run Shark instead. Recycler is a tech card that seems more suited for gadget decks or something similar, not a scrap deck, because there's a heavy lack of machines versus beast-type monsters. Goblin is a nice card because at worst, it's a defensive wall with that commonly prevents OTKs and frequently will still get its scoop effect after the battle phase ends, because most opponents are not really going to waste a card effect to eliminate it from the field before it destroys itself. Due to its battle protection effect, Goblin is superior in effectiveness to Shark or Kong and still receives the benefit with Factory on the field. Despite the recycling capacity of scrap decks, I still like to run 2 copies for a little more consistency in getting it on the field and in my hand. If Worm had some other unique effect apart from its direct attacking, then maybe it would be worth something, but it does not, so in my opinion, it's really not worth anything. Searcher can be a nice card for this deck because it provides some effective field presence, obviously not field control because it's going to get run over rather easily, but presence, and can help increase the efficiency of Dragon and Twin's effect. Searcher can sometimes help neutralize OTKs due to its special summoning effect. Finally, through Golem's effect, Searcher can be summoned to the opponent's side of the field and will almost always destroy all their monsters, leaving a 100 or 300 factories on the field, attack position monster in their place. However, it can be a little situational because it doesn't get its effect when a scrap monster is destroyed as a result of battle. Notwithstanding, I do run 1 copy because it's useful enough that it warrants that 1 copy deck spot. Mind Reader is just not worth the effort. I'd skip it. Among the scrap synchro monsters, I do not like Atomic because it requires too many resources for far too little gain, and I don't like Archfiend because it's just a generic synchro monster with scrap in its name. And level 7 is not deck meaningful for Chimera synchro restriction. Twin and Dragon are obviously the 2 stars of the synchro group. I run 2 copies of Twin and 3 copies of Dragon because Dragon is easier to bring out than Twin, so you're going to be using it more often. I also run 3 copies of Dragon because the recycling capacity of the deck chiefly focuses, at least for me, on grabbing Chimera from the graveyard, not returning a Dragon to the extra deck. Thus, I think the extra slot in the extra deck is not more valuable to me than the flexibility of focusing on the Chimera loop. I'd rather say I'll run 3 Dragons and have a little more flexibility in my Chimera looping than, oh my gosh, I need that 3rd Dragon spot for something else. I just don't see that. Scrapyard is a nice card, but I only run 1 copy. The problem with Yard is that outside of its combination with Orthros, having a Scrap tuner in your hand is not a meaningful advantage. If Scraps had a good in-hand tuner, one with this that could special summon itself without any type of restriction, this card would be much better, but they don't. Guts of Steel and Scrap Lube suffer the same fate as all archetype-specific revival cards in a Call of the Haunted World. They need to be great to be worth it. And these 2 cards, neither one is great. Scrapstorm is a staple at 3. Its quick play capacity allows it to serve a defensive purpose, wasting opponent card effects in an attempt to remove your cards from the field via destruction or not. Its dump effect is very useful, especially when you destroy a scrap that scoops from the graveyard, because the dumped card from Storm goes to the graveyard first and then can be added back to your hand by the effect of the scrap monster that you destroyed with Storm. Typically, the ideal strategy with Storm is to target Beast, dump a Chimera, and then add that Chimera back to your hand based off Beast's effect, so you have the Beast in the graveyard to be special summoned by Chimera whenever you can normal summon again. Sheen is not worth it, as it is more valuable to use Scrap's targets for synchro effects rather than Sheen's effect. Sheen is also another card that is significantly better with Factory on the field, but is just not very good at all when it's not on the field, because Scraps really aren't good at swarming without Factory, and Pendulum Scrap decks, those just are kind of a weird, in my experience, those are kind of just a weird hybrid that just don't seem to work very well. Factory is a staple for, while not deck critical, Factory to Scraps is akin to UA Stadiums to UAs. Both dramatically increase the probability of victory. 3 copies are essential. Crash can be an interesting side deck card to bring out against Floodgate decks or Pendulum decks, but that's all I see it really as a potential side deck option, maybe not even worth that. Rage is just not worth the deck space, for its effect is too situational and not good even in the best situations. There are numerous other cards that exceed it in usefulness. In my opinion, the non-scrap monsters in the scrap deck have to accomplish one of 2 tasks. First, they need to make themselves available to be targets for either Dragon or Twins effect, therefore increasing Synchro effect efficiency at little or no cost. Second, they must provide some level of field control to ward off OTK or large damage rushes, for while the Scrap Synchro monsters get to summon non-Synchro Scrap monsters when destroyed, there are a number of means to remove the Scrap Synchros from the field without destroying it, thus you get Bumpkiss. With these points in mind, obviously, I run 3 copies of a commonly run card in Scrap decks, Reborn Tengu. Tengu is nice, provides a nice 1700 attacker that thins the deck and nets a free summons when removed from the field. The obvious problem with Tengu is the fact that it requires the normal summons for the turn to put the first one on the field, but that problem's manageable. I also like to run 2 copies of Spell Striker to set up non-scrap synchro plays off of Beast or Goblin. It can be tribute fodder for Golem, and can produce an almost costless target for scrap synchro effect, and it can be a direct attacker for 600, and that's clean, because even if your opponent's able to summon something else to counter it, it gets run over, you take no battle damage, so big deal, you just lost a special summon monster that snuck in a 600 damage, or maybe even a little more. Running 1 copy of Mathematician is nice for aiding graveyard dumping of either Beast or Chimera, depending on what's in my hand, as well as that extra draw. This Scrap deck's, like a number of decks, kind of got hurt significantly when Mathematician got knocked down from 3 to 1. Finally, I run 3 copies of Speedroid Menko to prevent OTK rushes, as well as set up for the turn after, because it's a nice level 4, 2000 defense, and it turns monster field defense mode, typically making them easier to kill, so I can either go into a rank 4, or I can easily set up a Scrap Synchro. And the OTK protection is helpful also because, again, the lack of innate special summoning, and Scraps tend not to have a good first turn. Most decks have a much higher probability for an explosive first turn than Scraps. For the rest of my spells, I run 2 of my typical staples, 1 Raigeki, 1 Soul Charge. I side deck Book of Moon because there are just too many cannot target monsters running about at this moment, and Scraps cannot make effective combinations with the card itself. I run 1 copy of the quasi-staple Foolish Burial to aid graveyard dumping, and 1 copy of Terraforming to help speed acquisition of Factory. Furthermore, I run 2 copies of Forbidden Chalice. Chalice is a nice card in this deck because it not only has the ability to neutralize monster effects, could remove synchros without destroying, but it can also neutralize the destruction effects of Orthros, allowing a synchro play with less summoning resources demands, and also neutralizing Goblin's effect, giving you another turn of battle stalling, unless the opponent wants to remove it via card effect. Finally, I run 3 copies of a very old and annoying card that works nicely in Scrap, Messenger of Peace. Some people might say, yeah, this is a little trolly, but hey, what are you going to do? Scraps aren't super fast in the modern environment, and Messenger of Peace is a fantastic card that says, I get to dictate the pace of this duel, I'll crush you when I'm ready. For a deck that experiences a significant amount of destruction, especially from its own intent, one might be surprised to see the lack of supply squads in this deck. The problem I have with supply squad in this deck is that, again, Scraps have a difficult time swarming, especially when Factory's not available. Thus, it is difficult to facilitate a comeback with this deck, even with the additional resources that you get from Supply Squad. In my opinion, if you run Supply Squad, you almost have to run a card like Double Summons or Chain Summoning, and while both these cards can be useful at times, I just don't think they're reliable enough. Finally, for the traps, I like running 3 copies of Royal Decree, Simplify Game States, and 2 copies of Call of the Haunted for when those decrees are not up and running. The calls are also serve as nice targeting fodder for the Scrap Synchro effect. In a minute, time for the disjointed extra deck. 1 Crimson Blader, 1 Clearwing Synchro Dragon, 1 Black Rose Dragon, 1 Naturia Barkion, 1 Red Wyvern, 1 Naturia Beast, 1 Felgrand, 1 number 101, 1 Castel, 1 number 47 Nightmare Shark. Overall, I like the Scraps, I like the concept, but the glaring problem with this deck is a meaningful lack of good Scrap monsters. What this archetype needs, as I mentioned earlier, is a few monsters that can do quality work without requiring Factory on the field. However, despite these flaws, Scraps are a quality deck in the capacity that once they get rolling, it can be quite difficult for a lot of decks to stop them. Well, that's my Scrap deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.